Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, rather. I see our guest list is filling up nicely, so I'll just wait until that until the numbers settle. Right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Robert Colville, Director of the Centre for Policy Studies. I'm joined by Rachel Wolfe, founder of Public First and co-author of the Conservative Manifesto with Munira Mirza and me, but mostly her and Munira. Paul Goodman, the editor of Conservative Home, and Lord Finkelstein, Times columnist and veteran of the Conservative movement in many guises. A year ago, I think it's fair to say all of us were sitting on the edge of our seats, wondering, biting our nails and wondering whether Jeremy Corbyn might just be possibly about to do it again. By that evening, we were noting a really unprecedented, unexpected landslide election victory for Boris Johnson. I was getting progressively more drunk at the central office, along with others who worked on the campaign. But yet a year on, we found ourselves in a situation that no one could ever have expected. There's the pandemic has obviously had a shattering impact. We, as of today, in the next few hours, we may or may not have a trade deal. There may or may, in the coming year, there may or may not be a reshuffle. We may or may not have an economy. We may or may not have a union. There are, all sorts of big issues which have suddenly sort of emerged over the last year. So what I wanted to sort of explore today is what this political situation is, but also how things have changed. Is this still recognisably the same government that got elected, or has the departure of Dominic Cummings had more of an effect? And Rachel, if I can start with you.
Thank you. So yeah, a year ago, I remember mostly feeling completely weak-kneed with relief that I had not lost the election by producing a catastrophic manifesto. I spent most of the period of the election campaign feeling completely terrified that I was going to personally be responsible for something devastating. But also, and I think this is the sort of my one important point and question, being fairly confident that the manifesto we had written was deliverable and needed to be delivered. And as someone who spent most of their career working in public sector reform, education reform, I've always felt that the thing that is most underrated in the discussion about what government should do and talk about is how phenomenally difficult it is to deliver anything. And the manifesto, therefore, has some very, very clear and core priorities. I've talked about these before, but towns, how do they look? How do they feel? Do they feel safe? Can you get into them? Does it no longer feel like people's local towns are slowly declining, but rather on the up? Public services, and a year ago, I would have said that meant above all GP appointments, and GP appointments. Could you deliver public services, particularly the NHS, to people and feel trusted on them? And a post-Brexit settlement that included a visible difference in immigration policy. And that if you achieve those things, you would be able to say to people sort of 5 years later that you had delivered on those promises, that those promises were the things that mattered, and that you could be trusted to go again. And I think the question now is, should you try to deliver on those same promises, and is it possible to do so? Because we now are a year on in a situation where there is less money. Towns are in even more catastrophic state. We've got retail giants falling down left, right, and centre, and which was not a huge concern a year ago. It's not at all clear that we're going to be able to have full employment and jobs. And I think it was sort of sensible but very noticeable that all of the net zero announcements of the last few weeks were couched in the context of jobs. So I think very briefly, because I'm keen that most of this is a conversation between people, my view is yes, those still are the core priorities. Of course, it's of course, things can change from a manifesto. No one predicted a massive pandemic or huge economic catastrophe following on from it. But it is still central that in 4 years now, not 5, you are able to show that the fabric of people's places is improving, that public services are delivering, and that a post-Brexit world includes dealing with their core priorities, which does include migration. So I think those still are the priorities. I think it is even harder to deliver on them and requires an inordinate amount of focus and intent from the government. Without that, they are sunk. So I suppose rather boringly, my view is that everything has changed, but nothing has changed. And that while a week is a long time in politics, 4 years is no time at all. And this is what the government's now going to have to focus on as they emerge from the pandemic. There you go, Rob, I stuck to my 5 minutes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much. And now let's go over to Paul. And I'll just unmute you unless you've unmuted yourself.
Rob, thank you. I've just unmuted myself and want to start just by briefly commending the work of the Centre for Policy Studies, which I think really on economic questions particularly really is helping to lead the charge in debate on the centre right. Very briefly, I think it may be best to start thinking about the last year by thinking about the Prime Minister, who in the course of it has got divorced, got engaged, had a child and nearly died of coronavirus. So it's been an incredibly up and down year for him, just as it has been for everyone else. I could go on to try to sketch out another year that's going to be almost certainly no calmer, and to talk about 4 of the main challenges, as it seems to me, which would be the coronavirus, what comes out of the Brexit talks, the local and particularly the Scottish elections next year, and then finally, of course, the old theme of the economy. Other challenges will doubtless arise we haven't expected, but those are seem to me to be the big 4. And I could move on just to touch on the changes in Downing Street, the prospects of a reshuffle and all of that. Instead, in the time we've got, I really want to just ask a simple question, which has been preoccupying me a bit of late, and I don't know the answer to, and it might be interesting to have a discussion about, which is, can anything that depends on Parliament and the Conservative Parliamentary Party be worked through Parliament? Have the vaccines not been coming along over the hill? I suspect by now that the coronavirus policy, which depends on support for test and trace, might be in real trouble on the Conservative backbenches. We've already seen substantial rebellions. That's also applied to the housing policy, where MPs have queued up to attack the basis of the algorithm on which it's being presently planned, and that will have to change. I don't know whether that will hold for the 0.7% when the government bring in a bill that's associated with reducing that. I don't know either whether there's a sort of stomach in this parliamentary party for voting for tax rises or spending cuts if they eventually come, when really they were elected on a programme of getting Brexit done and, as Rachel said, really spending more money on things, nurses, doctors, schools, and so on. Very quickly, if I were being an optimist, I'd say, well, the vaccines are coming. Hopefully, the Brexit situation will be clear one way or another. MPs will meet in Parliament again. You won't have this phenomenon of everyone simply doing business by WhatsApp groups. And I'd add that with a majority of 80, usually if you have big majorities, there's a bit of room somewhere for a lot of rebellions. If I was being a pessimist from the government's point of view, I think I wonder whether or not there was some big long-term change coming over the very nature of MPs, whereby they're less party animals following a whip than constituency champions who do what they think their constituents want, above all, and perhaps to what they want to do themselves. And there's really some evidence over time, even without Brexit, that MPs are becoming more independent-minded, more prone over a long period of time to vote against the whip. And this proliferation of research groups that we're seeing, the Northern Research Group, the COVID Research Group, the Common Sense Group, all these things, they may die away like some of their predecessors, or they may be a sign that something more fundamental is going on. So I'm going to stop and leave that question hanging in the air. I should say that that change brings, I think, some good things as well as some bad things with it, but it will make it more difficult to govern if a majority of 80 is really nothing like what a majority of 80 would have delivered 15 or 20 years ago.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about myself. Is it just that we're all just a bit ratty because of this past year we've had, when we've all been shut up in our houses and not able to see people? And is that sort of being reflected in politics, or is there something broader? And I think there's actually an interesting point as well about you know, we're now back in an era of two-party politics, apparently, but in an age when you know, when age of identity politics, and when everything is more vociferous than ever. But before I go on too much, I'll pass over to Danny for his thoughts.
Thank you, Robert. And let me just share Paul's view that I think you've done incredibly well with the CPS and really turned it into an organisation people must pay attention to. To try to describe the last year, or even to look forward to the next year without centering on coronaviruses, my mother's favourite joke was always, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the theatre? And that is what it would be. So the impact of that, I think, is bigger than we normally give it credit for, not just in terms of the last year, but in terms of the rest of this period of government. I thought Rachel's analysis was spot on. I think we absolutely do have to have, as a government, do have to deliver the things that the manifesto promised. And actually, I found myself perfectly at ease with most of the central proposals of the manifesto. It is, in my view, a reasonable centrist moderate thing to want to do, to level up and to create a second city. It was what George Osborne wanted to do, and to try to revive towns. Difficult though I think that will be. It seems to me to be centrally a good thing, and something that we should encourage. I think it has now got substantially harder. There's the first reason it's got harder is because of the money. I think that it's expensive to do the things that we promised to do, and I don't think that we can get around the fact that will require more money. And when the economy is not growing, that means requiring more taxes. And I'm not sure that I think the Conservative Party's got its head round the fact that that is the case. And goes around on who has to pay those taxes, and whether or not it can retain the coalition it has when it needs to make people pay for those things. And I think there will be the Prime Minister has a kind of, his cake is philosophy, you know, well, what we'll do is we'll spend the money and we'll cut the taxes and see whether the money rolls in, and the Chancellor doesn't, and I think that's the recipe for a dispute between them. I suspect that Dominic Cummings might have sided more with the Prime Minister, less on cakeist grounds than on the grounds that he hated all forecasts and thought they were stupid, and therefore you couldn't kind of tie your government to some forecast about the finances. But with Dan Rosenthal, I think that'll be different. So I think the government will have changed in that way, and there'll be quite a lot of debate inside the government as to whether or not they need to meet these bills with more expenditure. And I don't think, and I think this is where Rachel's point is so important, I don't think it'll be enough simply to tell people you're going to build a road to their town that won't be built for 15 years. That may be the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do, and it probably is the way of reviving towns. It's just that I think if you want to keep the votes of those people, you're going to have to do something more immediate. They feel more quickly, and I think that's financially a big difficulty. There is also underneath it, I think, the Conservative Party having come to terms with the fact that the politics and economics of Brexit go in two different ways. The economics of Brexit are, we've now got to be even more competitive. I mean, that's what the European Union Union wants a level playing field for. I don't know why they're bothering being so anxious about a level playing field, because the Conservative Party isn't going to remove the level playing field because its voters are now people who believe in Europe, who rely on the European model. And so therefore the result of Brexit, one of the reasons why I wasn't in favour of it necessarily, was because it will be to have this political pressure to push up taxes and to push up spending just at the moment when the economic pressure is in the opposite direction. But I think the politics of it are clear, and the Conservative Party's made its choice. But Paul is asking the question, will people get their heads round it? It was interesting to me that the rebellions were on sort of libertarian versus security issues, where the Conservatives' new voters are more security minded. There's a question of whether that can be resolved. So I think the government has all of those things and one other thing to contend with, which is that the extraordinary feature of the last election is that it bucked time for a change. Time for a change is so strong. The Conservative Party has now increased its vote in each election since 1997. That's an extraordinary thing to happen. And it's particularly extraordinary in repeated elections when you're in power. So the question to my mind is, at some point, the time for a change is going to become extremely difficult for the government. And I think that could easily happen in the next year as people begin to realise what the economic costs of COVID were, and it'll be very hard for the whole of the party to deal with.
Thanks, Sonny. And actually, I mean, on that point, one of the things that someone said to me, which I think is very true, is, you know, the sort of the strategic goal for Boris Johnson has to be that this is seen as the first term of the Boris Johnson government, not the, you know, fourth now term of Tory government, because of that, you know, they do, because at that point the change kicks in. So if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A. But I'm going to start off with a couple. And this touches on some of the debates that have been going on about the sort of the reset and whether you which set of vote, if you have to make choices, which set of voters you prioritise. Do you see the recent changes, the sort of the departure of Cummings, etc., the extra stress on the green agenda, although that was actually there in the, it was there on the front page of the manifesto along with the other pledges, but do you see that as a change of style, or it's sort of a change of substance?
Who's that for?
Oh, whoever wants to come in.
I kick you first. I had a sort of very mixed view of Dominic Cummings. It's somebody I really didn't know. Rachel probably knows better. There were lots of things about him that I thought, apart from, well, the first thing that I thought was pretty extraordinary is I think he was an incredibly focused winner of a general election. He focused on a message. He knew what would win a general election. I thought that was very impressive. But secondly, I actually liked a lot of the challenges that he issued to the government machine. There were some of them are the ones that kind of Rachel alluded to, which was how do you get people to do things. There was some about what does this country become, and I think he's right about the technological revolution and this country being a science centre. I think he was quite focused on that, and I think he also saw the need to deliver. So all of those things were good things. His style personally was not mine with people. And then I had one political disagreement, which was that he thinks that a lot, he thought, I think, or thinks that a lot of the processes of government are the sort of legal processes, including the court system and the civil service, are like just one long drag on doing anything. And while I understand that point, I think I'm much more institutionally conservative than he is, both as a matter of style and as a matter of substance. So I think Dan Rosenfield is a very good choice. Whether he has quite the same political focus, I think he'd still have a lot of focus on getting things done, and he's pretty tough as well. So we'll see.
I mean, just to follow on from that, and I know precisely the opposite people that Danny does. I don't know Dan Rosenfeld at all. But as I understand it, he is a chief of staff, not a chief strategist. And therefore, I think I would hope that the great thing he will do is focus on delivery, but the thing he will not do is decide what to deliver on. And that seems to me the substance question. So far, there's no sign of it, right? The SR was limited, but there was a levelling up fund. the net zero announcements were obviously very carefully couched in terms of jobs as a way of kind of maintaining the red wall, blue wall, whatever you want to call it, coalition. I think it is much too early to say whether on the hundreds and thousands of judgments governments need to make every day, they will be able to maintain the kind of laser focused instinct on these voters. There are definitely people in government who have it, myriad being an example, but we don't know yet. But so far, there's nothing they've done that would suggest there has been a substance shift. On moving fast, I'm also a conservative, and I think institutions matter, and indeed in the long term, I think one of the ways in which you level up is to rethink civic institutions and long-term institutions in different places, including through devolution. But I am also very conscious it's unbelievably hard to get government machines to move. You know, I'm not the most competent person on the planet, but I sweated for 5 years to get a couple of hundred free schools open. That's small compared to what the government now needs to achieve. So it is not, anyone in government who wants to achieve things does need to try and push hard and fast and occasionally brutally.
Yeah, and Paul, I mean, as well as your take, I mean, I'm interested. So the two things that everyone diagnosed, I mean, I wrote columns about this, you wrote columns about this, I'm fairly sure Danny wrote columns about this. We're saying the two things: they need someone to make the trains run on time, and they need someone to talk to the parliamentary party. And you know, but from what you were saying in your opening remarks, it feels like, you know, you think that's like even the appointment of the smoothest and most wonderfully diplomatic individual in the world to listen to MPs and pat them on the shoulder would not alter this fundamental sort of this more individualistic culture that's gripped the party.
Paul, you're muted.
Paul, you're muted.
So just unmuting myself. Well, the question is whether that will happen and how much difference it will make. Just on the subject of Dominic Cummings, I was always very suspicious of the idea, I've not been in government, but that you could simply sort of somehow batter the civil service into reform. I think the civil service is there before you come in. It's there when you go. It's very difficult to do this, but I thought Dominic Cummings deserved his chance, just as Boris Johnson deserves his chance on his majority of to make it work. Having played this major part in the referendum campaign in 2016, and then in the run-up to the general election last year, I thought Dominic really, you know, as I say, should have been entitled to sort of have his go at it. And in the end, it hasn't worked out and he's gone. I've not noticed much of a change since then. There was I think a gap when Dominic Cummings went, into which a lot of speculation poured about this becoming a very different sort of government. I haven't really seen that. I think the one area in which things have been a bit different is on the environment speech and the follow-up this week, because that clearly does seem to have been held up in the system. And I wonder to what degree COP26 and Joe Biden coming along have made a difference to Boris Johnson really wanting to push this agenda, which he's very keen on anyway. I think it's significant that while there's opposition to it on some parts of the centre-right outside Parliament, I haven't seen really any significant opposition at all inside. I think one of the reasons for that must be that because any pain is largely postponed. The pain of trying to get to net zero 2050 for taxpayers and for consumers and from business really is going to come on a bit later down the road. And what struck me as an editor this year is how many pieces I've had in from Conservative MPs, including Red Wall MPs, new Conservative MPs, who are fully behind the green stuff that Boris Johnson's trying to do. And as I say, one of the explanations for this must be there's not a lot of pain now, which they feel like protesting about in Parliament.
And indeed, quite a lot of them can probably see the chance of some nice green investment coming their way for
Quite so.
or what have you. Loads and loads of questions coming in, so we'll try and rattle through the topics a bit. Keir Starmer. So I am an outlier on this, in that I think that the British public He's got good ratings. I think the British public haven't really taken a look at him because COVID's been going on, no one cares. And as with Ed Miliband, I don't see how anyone with that voice becomes Prime Minister. But that is a purely personal view. I mean, is he keeping you guys awake at nights? Do you think he? I mean, obviously, there were the three things which got the landslide last time were Boris, Brexit, and Corbyn. And Starmer is a very substantial upgrade on Corbyn.
But Rachel, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I say very briefly, yeah, I mean, I do think that it is much harder to keep this sort of broad coalition together when you're not against Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, he was a huge factor. On the flip side, though, to answer Paul's question, I do wonder whether the rebelliousness of Parliament might start to shift if and when they see Labour as a consistent and intelligent threat. I think we all got used to a world in which Labour was in chaos and couldn't manage itself. But assuming that the kind of instinct of self-preservation that the Conservative Party has always had kicks in again, I think that might lower rebellion in the next few years, actually, and create some more cohesion. So it makes the election harder, but it might make governing a little bit easier.
I would say, Keir Starmer is quite an impressive individual. I think people can imagine him being Prime Minister. I think he is objectively just a substantially less dangerous than Jeremy Corbyn. I certainly feel that. So I certainly feel there's a trade-off between him being more electable and bringing in other people I don't agree with him, but being a lot less dangerous if he got elected. But where I think the question of whether he's electable, I mean, people can be elected. I mean, John Major won a big victory in 1992 with a voice objectively no better than Keir Starmer's. But I think that he'll impress people in other ways. I think the big thing in front of him is still a choice, right? He's very shrewdly decided to pitch his battle with the left on a territory where they can't beat him, which is on anti-Semitism. That is both a moral choice, to be fair to him, but it's also quite a shrewd political choice. And they idiotically have not appreciated that and have decided to fight him on that. But he therefore hasn't yet had to make his very big decisions about where they are on fiscal policy. And I thought Annalise Dodds was pretty weak in response, both personally not great, but also pretty weak sort of in substance terms in her response to the budget. Although part of their problem is because the government doesn't know where it's going fiscally, it's hard for Labour to position itself. But I do think they've still got that decision in front of them. So it's too early to say. He's definitely picked a winning formula. A lot will depend on the economy. I've never thought that a culture war election, I mean, apart from it being personally regarding it as undesirable, I've never thought it was a real election. Never thought it was really an election winner, because while people might be culturally conservative, they're not in favour of wars. So I don't know. So I think he could be, quite hard to beat, but from the country's point of view, that's for good reason.
And just before I get to Paul, I saw last time I checked, the Tories still have like double the level of Labour on answer the question, who do you most trust to run the economy? And that is the one thing which is keeping their poll ratings where they are. Paul.
On the Tory poll ratings, one point no one's made to date is how buoyant the Conservative poll ratings are. After a year of turbulence, they're still knocking around on 40%. So it's worth just wondering for a moment what sort of state the parliamentary party would be if they were down in the mid-30s or lower. I mean, on Keir Starmer, just a few quick points. One, after Corbyn, any direction really is up with your new leader. I mean, second, what he does have that Boris Johnson, I think, can't get is this impression of competence. It may be only a thin veneer, and he hasn't been sort of fully tested yet. But I'm not sure that Boris Johnson, who may come into fashion, his facility for sort of entertaining, inspiring people may again hit the sweet spot. But for sort of competence, I'm not sort of entirely sure that it's going to be all there. I mean, the test for Starmer is going to be when he has to break out of, as I think of it, being a bit of a John Smith, which is making your progress by being purely oppositional and putting the government in the dock. At some point, as Danny said, he's going to have to come forward with his own prospectus. And when he does that, he's going to be open to counterattack. And we'll have to see how he does then. I'm still not sure at a sort of deeper level he's yet managed to get through to those voters in red wall seats and the like that Labour lost only last year.
The question from John Pete. Paul, you touched on the Scottish elections. I mean, he'd like to hear more from the panel about the threats to the Union in Scotland and Northern Ireland and even Wales. And adds, might some Tories see advantage in reverting to England alone? I mean, I am always struck by the fact that, you know, it would be in the narrow electoral self-interest of the Tory party to forget about the Union and to stop sending money north of the border, but they will absolutely never do it. The unionist thing is absolutely core to the identity.
On that narrow point, we did a Connholm survey a while ago, for what it's worth. It found something like a kind of fifth of English nationalist sentiment. And then we did one a while ago where we found very little. I mean, I think that this English nationalism question, it hasn't really been tested. And that were we to reach a point where it seriously looked as though Scotland was going to leave, I can't really believe that any real substantial support for it in the Conservative Party, because the loss of the unity of the whole country is such a huge thing that you really must realise, looking at it, that it would be a sort of complete nightmare to have to deal with the defence aspects of it, the constitutional aspects of it, your future relations with a country which has been part of yours for 300 years. It's almost an unimaginable thing. I think on the elections themselves, it is very tough. None of us, sitting here in England or thereabouts, are I think in a very good position to pronounce authoritatively. What I hope happens is that Boris Johnson and company give Douglas Ross and the Conservative leadership in Scotland the space and time to do it their way and to take on Nicola Sturgeon in the way they want to, which seems to be to want to try to change the conversation from the independence question to meat and drink questions about how well or badly, and it is badly, the Scottish education system is run, or the Scottish health system is run, and indeed the way Scotland's been run since the SNP got their hands on it. That seems to be what Douglas Ross and company want to do. I hope Boris and co can give them the space, because as far as the independent sentiment in Scotland goes, on the one hand, this has not been tested yet in a second referendum campaign, if that happens. On the other hand, you can't help feeling, when you look at polling and the attitudes of younger people, it's getting late in the day.
Sorry, Rachel, I know you have to go and pick up your kids. So have you have anything to share on the union?
So I actually completely agree with Paul on that. That's the substantive attack. So thank you. And I did not include my unbelievable admiration for the CPS and everything it's doing at the beginning, or indeed my admiration for my fellow panelists. So I enjoyed this immensely, and I'm sorry, as long as COVID destroys the wraparound childcare for my kids, I'm going to have to leave every day at 2:35. Thank you so much.
Danny, do you want to come in on Scotland or indeed Northern Ireland?
I don't have tremendously much to add. I agree with Paul that that's the core issue, and I know that it was Gordon Brown couldn't sort of understand when he talked to David Cameron why the Conservative Party would support the union when it was so obviously against its political interests to do so, and I don't think he just got the way that people feel about it. But I don't have anything useful to add to what he said about what to do now.
Well, so we can't avoid this topic, I'm afraid. But Raphael Baer of The Guardian asked, regarding the politics of Brexit as opposed to the sort of practicalities, does it better serve the PM to be in antagonism with Brussels, having someone to blame for an underwhelming sovereignty dividend? Raphael's words, not mine. Or would you rather have a mission accomplished moment and let Brexit slide back down in salience? In other words, is Get Brexit Done? Does the logic of Get Brexit Done? Which is the more powerful?
Okay, so it all depends what you think the political impact of the economic impact of various scenarios will be. My view is that it's quite likely that we'll get a quite a sort of quite a poor economic outcome over a long period of time out of Brexit. I know that other people will disagree with that, but out of a no deal we'll get a sharper one, which people will notice more, and I think that could feed into the narrative about the government and be part of the time for a change feeling. So I think that if you feel that your politics is very dependent on the economy, you'll want to get a deal. But the internal politics definitely works the other way, right? The internal politics works. You can improve your situation with the base in Parliament by standing up and having a fight about this and not making any concessions. In the end, however, and that's the choice, right? Which of those do you think politically will be more damaging? But in the end, I don't think Boris Johnson makes that political calculation, because I happen to be among the small minority of people who think that Boris Johnson is very ideological about this one thing. That this whole business of him having 2 speeches, and I think that was 2 articles, and never really believing in Brexit and all, I don't think that's true. I think he's always believed in it pretty firmly. I think that he strongly believes in the sovereignty element of it, and that the most belligerent person in the government on the negotiations is actually him. So I don't think ultimately the choice between these things will be entirely political. It'll be partly ideological.
Paul, any thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking about the Conservative Party as a whole, and then work my way to Boris Johnson and what may happen. I think among the members, no deal wouldn't, at least on paper, be a great problem. You get up to the Parliamentary Party, and I think feelings, again, on paper, would be more mixed, although a lot of the most committed former Remainers are no longer in the Commons. The Parliamentary Party does contain a big chunk of people who voted for Remain, and also Leavers who are basically pro-deal. So were there to be no deal, I think as I say, the sentiment would be a bit more mixed up. When you get up to cabinet level, I can't really think of one member of it who's enthusiastic about no deal. The big institutional interests, the Treasury or BEIS, won't be in favour of it. And Michael Gove clearly sees that no deal would be a very complicating factor, in all probability, in the Scottish elections coming next year. So this takes me to what Danny said about Boris Johnson. I think, as so often, and having worked with him a bit, I've seen this, it's very hard sometimes to get inside Boris Johnson's head. On the one hand, there'll be all these reasons, which I've just laid out, suggesting he's got sort of support in his own party for a deal, for good reasons, particularly at the top. But I think there's always a sort of strain of him that's always yearned for the open sea, particularly as far as regulation and constraint is concerned. And therefore, I think there is a bit of him that's hankering for what he calls this Australian type deal, that really is no deal, where he could do anything he likes. Now, if no deal happens, I think the situation might unfold really as follows. First of all, cards on table. I've always expected a deal, so I'll be proved wrong if there's no deal. But it strikes me that most other people in business and politics have too. Why? Well, because there always is a deal, and after all, there was one last time, and the EU always fixes something at the 11th hour. So if there isn't one, I think it will be sort of quite a shock to the system. The question then, if there's major disruption, and if the 2 sides of the table can't get back together quickly, which may well be the case, I think there's then a sort of question about who the public blames. On the one hand, you will have a lot of people, including the most fervent former Remainers, blaming the government. On the other hand, the government, no doubt, will blame the EU for trying to essentially, as they will portray it, not let us be an independent country. And I'm not really sure which side of the ledger public opinion will come down on the side of in that case. I mean, on Brexit generally, obviously, I don't take the same determined view as Danny about it. I think over a long period of time, it does give you more freedom to do what you want with your own economy. And the whole logic of Brexit is to exchange that for the certainty you got inside the European system. But as for deal and no deal, we will see. But if no deal happens, I really do think it will be a substantial shock to the whole political establishment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I like you, I've always sort of thought there would be a deal in the end, not least because we're so, this is such a hard version of Brexit compared, compared with where we started out. The actual, the differences between them are fairly small. But equally, I think Emmanuel Macron has played the part of the evil European kind of coming to the table and twirling his moustache in villainous fashion at the last minute. He's done a very good job of giving the government that excuse if things do fall apart. I mean, I think there's a sense almost that as with the coronavirus and spending and tax and all these, that there were quite a lot of shoes we're waiting to see drop next year. For all the drama of this year, the government has kept the economy on methadone with the furlough scheme, for example. Unemployment isn't expected to reach its peak until next year, although the vaccine may change that. So we're still in this incredibly uncertain thing where there's so many things may go away, which is a really sort of interesting thing. So a question from David Henke, the journalist, which is actually something I'd not thought about at all. But he said, what will be the impact of the government's new immigration policy over the next 4 years? Analysis out tomorrow says a 20% jump in skilled applicants from the rest of the world wanting to come here, but at the same time, skilled Brits in Europe renouncing their citizenship. I mean, what does a less European and more global Britain look like? And actually, what are the political implications for the Conservatives? I mean, we're going to have the boundary review, which changes some of the stuff, but obviously, the Tories are not as strong with young voters and ethnic minority voters as other sections of the population.
Immigration? I think immigration is, so far, the government's immigration policy has been a kind of reproof to people who was presented Boris Johnson as some sort of post-EU referendum ultra-populist Bannonite figure, influenced by what happened in the referendum campaign and what was said back and forth about Turkey. Actually, immigration has been a very interesting dog so far that hasn't barked, in the sense that Johnson's dropped the net target, and insofar as it's possible to discern what the policy is, it's seen in some ways as a more liberal one. So, for example, certain requirements to compel firms to seek to employ British employees first before they look abroad have gone. And if you talk to people in the, as it were, the anti-immigration or the immigration skeptic lobby, they're not at all happy with the policy. Now that will or may change as unemployment really begins to bite, because then the competition for jobs will become greater. But so far, I think Boris Johnson's immigration policy, it looks rather more like the kind of policy that I'd have expected to come out of him when he was mayor of London, when he was in favour of amnesties for illegal migrants, than the policy of the Vote Leave era of 2016.
Yeah, I basically agree with that. Look, I mean, if you reduce the supply from abroad of unskilled labour, price of unskilled labour will rise, which will put pressure on businesses that employ a lot of unskilled labour. Meanwhile, the price of skilled labour may go down, right? And that is probably that may be a beneficial outcome, or it may not. It depends what the wash is. I take the view that people really did choose this policy, right? They do know what's being discussed, and they do actually believe it. And I've always felt that sort of liberal globalists, and I certainly am very sympathetic to that worldview, have not taken people's hesitancy about this seriously enough, and that Brexit was one of the results of that, of not doing so. So I think I do think it'll have these kind of dual economic effects. On the whole, I suspect you would get a more dynamic economy with more immigration, but people really don't want very large quantities of immigration, and you have to reflect that. And that's been tested repeatedly. And I think it's, it's only democratic and sort of reasonably humble to take people's view into account in creating a policy.
Although it seems like people are completely fine with high skilled immigration, the sort of professors, entrepreneurs. I mean, so a couple of questions. Someone, Alex Morton, actually, one of our team here at the CPS, pushing back, Danny, on your point about culture wars, and someone else sort of saying, look, the left are already fighting one, don't the right have to fight back?
Yeah.
And there's a broader issue there that argue like. We touched on it slightly earlier. We've gone from an era when the strength of the two main parties seem to be dissipating to an era when suddenly both Tories and Labour are in a sort of 35 to 40% in the polls range. The Tories achieved this effectively by crushing UKIP and the Brexit Party. One of the keys to a successful Tory the Tory electoral hegemony is surely keeping that coalition together. So what happens if you get people like Nigel Farage, Laurence Fox on the right making these culture war arguments, making that the kind of new immigration, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, there are some people who are drawn by. So let me just get this straight. So I am personally, what I was trying to emphasize is that people don't want wars, right? And I think if the left start culture wars, the electorate will punish them for doing that. And the right will be able to resist that while remaining in the realm of common sense. What I'm against is trying to start our own culture war. And the other thing that I would say is not to be blind to points that are being made. It's right that we should, for example, reflect on British history and the effect colonialism has had. Right, there's still a long way to go on women's rights. There's a long way to go on trans rights. There's still a lot of racism. There are a lot of people who are homophobic, and the centre right's got to be on the progressive side actually of those things. Where I disagree is when with a sort of what one might call the sort of critical theory is with this kind of very dogmatic kind of ultra-liberalism that sometimes leaves common sense behind. But if the centre right takes a kind of common sense position, so for example you point out the stupidity of the slogan of defund the police and how embarrassing that it is to use that terminology in this country, particularly when it was a sort of US slogan that doesn't relate here. If you can fight on those grounds, then I'm all for doing that. Resisting stupidity on behalf of common sense is why I'm a conservative. What I'm not in favour of is kind of launching our own kind of fake culture wars about the ECHR, which people don't actually feel, and then all they can see is that you're picking fights instead of getting on with trying to rebuild towns.
Rob, hi, can I come in? It's just hello.
Yes.
No, please do.
Rob, hi, can I come in? I'm not picking you up clearly.
Yes, please.
Fine, okay. Fine, I know, I've got you now. You wrote a column yourself about culture wars in which you asked an interesting question at the start, which is, I think, what are we talking about here? Because there's so many different aspects of these so-called culture wars one can cover. And this is sort of everything from people like J.K. Rowling being, she's big enough to look after herself, being assailed on Twitter by masses of people. And there are people who are in a less good position to resist than J.K. Rowling, who get shut down, to free speech in universities, to Black Lives Matter, to, well, all these things. So this is a sort of story of lots of moving parts. And the first thing you've got to work out is what government can do and what government can't. I mean, there's a very limited role for government, I think, in policing what goes on Twitter. There's quite a big role for government in ensuring that there's free speech in universities. But I think at the heart of the question really is this. I mean, I agree with Danny that people don't like government declaring wars of any kind. I think it's more difficult when you're actually stuck in a war and you've got to do something. And I don't think the government can keep entirely quiet, and it shouldn't really, about a central question, which is really that at the heart, for me, of the culture wars is a kind of narrative that says Britain's history is basically something that we should be wholeheartedly ashamed of. And that seems to me to come out of what I can understand of critical race theory. And I think that the centre-right, in responding to that, has to take a balanced view, which is that, of course, there are things in our history that we should be ashamed of, as in the case of any country and almost any tradition. But there's also much in British history to be proud of. And when I'm thinking of the new voters who Boris Johnson gained last December, as well as a lot of the old ones, I really think that they will dislike this sense that we all have to feel guilty about everything that Britain's ever done anywhere. And I think it's no bad thing if ministers get a bit more on the front foot about that.
Fair enough. We're not going to get through all of the questions. I'm really sorry, but I'll try. Just Amy Gray, who's just asked whether the Tories will win City Hall in London. No, I don't know whether either of the others want to disagree with me, but Chris.
So just to come in briefly about that, I think, as well as Scotland, the two contests that really will attract attention next year will be the West Midlands and Teesside, not London. I think it'll be the Tory progress or lack of it there, with Andy Street in Birmingham and Ben Houch in Teesside, that will be a kind of judged as a measure of success and failure, rather than London, which the Tories are frankly not going to win.
Chris Deary, my old boss, who's not terribly kind to the Tories at the moment, says one charge made against Boris is that he appointed the cabinet based on loyalty as the primary quality. But you can actually go further and say, this government was designed to be run from the centre, brackets by Dom Cummings. The appointment is a very, very powerful number 10, and relatively, which was setting the agenda in all sorts of areas. If there is a reshuffle next year, which seems to be on the cards, do you think that we're going to see a move back towards cabinet government? And who are the people who you'd expect to come in, or what shape do you think that would look like?
Very difficult to know who would come in. So I'm not. Everybody always says every cabinet is like the worst, the weakest cabinet ever, full of totally useless people. And sometimes you look at the people and think, well, actually, they're not, like that. Sometimes I don't completely agree with their approach. That's certainly the case in my view of Pretty, but but sometimes when I don't agree with when I haven't agreed with them in the past, like Dominic Raab, I don't think he's doing badly at all. And I think it'd be hard to say, he's like he's like totally weak foreign secretary by comparison with historical foreign secretaries. I don't think that's particularly true. So I think people can overemphasize that. It's often a way of like saying, not the king, but his advisors. I think the thing that gives me most concern about the government is actually number 10 and the Prime Minister, right? He has a lot of very great electoral qualities, right? His can be, if you like that sort of thing, he can be very charismatic, and I quite enjoy him a lot of the time. He has got a kind of very good self-deprecating humour, which goes down very well. He's open and optimistic. Those things are good things. But the truth is, he's also somebody who likes to say yes to things and finds it hard to say no. He's not very well disciplined. And he got himself tangled up with, his advisors wanting one tone for a government which didn't jibe with his own tone, has had to remove them all. So that's where I think the problem is. And I think people going on about the cabinet sometimes a bit of a distraction. And the moment you ask this question, well, who are you going to bring in? Right, there are some great people. I've just giving. She won't thank me particularly, but I mean, I think Lucy Fraser, for example, is a brilliant person, but and very capable person. And there are lots of junior people, from Claire Coutinho and of course Neil O'Brien, whom I think is fantastic, who are going to make great ministerial careers. But do I think that alter people's basic perception of the government? Probably not.
All the fault lies not in the stars, but in number 10.
It's rather unfair to blame Dominic Cummings for what's happened, I think, because by the end, he was locked away pretty much, trying to find answers to test and trace and the coronavirus. I think there's been a sort of more institutional pattern at number 10 for a while. And I think we certainly saw it in the Nick Timothy era when Theresa May was Prime Minister, of trying to exercise very strong central control of cabinet ministers. So we've really not entirely seen what this lot can do when their wings are spread. If there's a no-deal Brexit, I think it'd be a jolly odd time to have a big reshuffle, and Boris Johnson probably won't want to disturb anyone, and we'll have to wait for a bit. Is this the strongest cabinet he could have? No, I would bring back one or two people who are not there because Boris Johnson candidly has seen them as a sort of rivals and people he doesn't want eyeing him around the table. I can't think of any reason why Jeremy Hunt shouldn't be in the cabinet. I think you need one or two experienced people like Liam Fox on the other end of the table, but you never make that many changes. It's going to only be 4 or 5. I don't think he's going to do that. I think instead, you will see people come up who are a bit lower down in the ministry, who are more red wall, as it were, in flavour, or who keep up the Tory numbers for promoting women and ethnic minorities. And these may well be people like Victoria Atkins and Lucy Fraser, who Danny mentioned, or Helen Whately, who didn't seem to me to be flavour of the month during the Cummings era, but might do better now. I mean, finally, I will be very sorry to lose our columnist Neil O'Brien to the ministerial ranks, but I mean, frankly, we'd be lucky to have him, and his promotion further is long overdue.
Well, I'm not going to object to the gush of praise for Neil, because he's a very, very nice guy and very bright. I'd add one point actually to your, Paul, your original point about the unrest in the party, which I've made in the column, and I was trying to look up the exact statistic, but I think it's basically there are more people who used to have jobs of one and now don't, under Cameron or May or even beforehand, than that group of sort of people is larger than the size of the majority. So there are a group of people who you can't actually offer the prospect of promotion to.
I mean, furthermore, just coming back to the kind of discussion that Rachel and Dan and I were trying to have earlier about whether the party's got sort of stomach for tax rises or spending cuts or whatever further down the line, I think it's quite hard for parties to reinvent themselves in government. They're usually more inclined to do this coming in from opposition, as in 79 and 2010.
Yeah. Well, so both of you, one final question. It is extraordinary how quickly, how nothing is ever settled in politics. Everything changes. No one could imagine we'd be here a year ago. But let's say we reconvene in 2021. Do you expect us to be looking back on a good year for Boris, a bad year for Boris, another year of tumult and chaos, or the year in which the vaccines were delivered and the economy roared back and we all got back to living our lives?
I think it's going to be quite a difficult year, as my own view. I think that the economic impact of the coronavirus will be larger than we think. I'm less optimistic about this immediate bounce back. I think somebody described it, the resolution manager has talked about it possibly being K-shaped, where one group of people goes in one direction and another group, that's very possible. I think that there'll be, you know, unemployment's going to be very large, even on the Treasury's own estimate. Or the OBR's estimate, the ones that Treasuries are using. So yeah, I think it's going to be quite a difficult year, is my view.
Any year with Scottish elections in the middle of it, in this climate, and with the SNP, you know, apparently impervious to all the problems in their own ranks and all the difficulties in Scotland, is going to be a very difficult year anyway. Looks as though it will re-raise independence questions, sadly, and that's really quite enough of a challenge, even if you didn't have all the others Danny's just talked about: coronavirus, Brexit, the economy, and maintaining the discipline of the parliamentary party in the face of all of this.
Yes, I mean, in one column I wrote, I sort of listed the great challenges which the government has set itself, and you rapidly come to realize, you know, levelling up, net zero, saving the union, saving the economy, delivering the coronavirus vaccine. You know, you rapidly come to realise that this is not going to be a calm period, and there is a lot to happen. But thank you both, and Rachel and Absentia, for her insights. Thank you all for watching. Please do keep following the CPS at CPS Think Tank. Sign up to our newsletter for details of more events like this. But in the meantime, thank you very much to our panelists, and hope you all have a very happy festive season, as much as you can under the current circumstances.